All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is Friday, May 1st, and what we're going to do today is just read through the primary source document you were assigned to read for this most recent assignment about U.S. neutrality during World War II. So, as a quick review, what you guys have read so far is that, or learned so far before you've read the speech, is that when World War II started, a great number of Americans, a significant percentage of Americans, wanted the United States to avoid being involved in World War II in any way, shape, or form. But as World War II progressed in Europe and in Asia, it became more and more clear to American leadership, and especially Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that the United States needed to step in and become involved in some way, shape, or form. So they became more involved as World War II progressed, as they pledged to sell military goods to the Allied powers, Great Britain, Greece, China, on a cash and carry basis. Then, in 1940, in September, the United States sent destroyers, naval ships to Great Britain so they could fight against the Nazis. And then this kind of culminated in 1940, 1941 with President Roosevelt changing the American policy towards World War II, outwardly, very clearly changing the American policy. So he made this speech called the Arsenal for Democracy speech in December of 1940, and then the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941 to go along with what Roosevelt proclaimed in this Arsenal for Democracy speech. So we're going to read this speech together, or I'm going to read it with you. Oh, man, I misspelled sections. That stinks. We're going to read this speech together. I've got some highlights and annotations in this Arsenal for Democracy speech. They might show up in your text. If they don't, I'm sorry. This is the speech. All right, it's kind of a dense speech. It's from a fireside chat that Roosevelt made one evening, 9:30 on December 29th. If you'd like, you can actually go back and listen to it. You can put it up on YouTube, and I think that it's there. We have some excerpts here that we're going to read together. So Roosevelt starts. He's making the speech to the American people, kind of informing them on this change in the American government's policy towards World War II. He says, "My friends, never before since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock has our American civilization been in such danger as it is now, or as now." He says, "For on September 27th, 1940, this year, by an agreement signed in Berlin, 3 powerful nations, 2 in Europe and 1 in Asia, joined themselves together in the threat that if the United States of America interfered with or blocked the expansion program of these 3 nations, a program aimed at world control, they would unite in ultimate action against the United States." So the 3 countries he's talking about are Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. And he goes on to say that the Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life in their own country, but also to enslave all of Europe and then use the resources to dominate the rest of the world. So he's being very clear. He's saying that Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, according to FDR, were enemies of the United States. They weren't at war with them yet, but eventually, he said, they would, if not stopped, want to take over the United States. So what happens next? He says, "At this moment, the forces of the states," those states he's referencing here are Germany, Italy, and Japan, "that are leagued against all peoples who live in freedom are being held away from our shores." So he says, Germany, Italy, and Japan are being held away from the United States. The Germans and Italians are being blocked on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean by the British and by the Greeks, and by thousands of soldiers and sailors who were able to escape from subjugated or conquered countries. In Asia, the Japanese are being engaged by the Chinese nation in another great defense, and the Pacific Ocean is the American fleet. He says, "Does anyone believe that we need to fear attack anywhere in the Americas in the Western Hemisphere while a free Britain remains our most powerful neighbor in the Atlantic? And does anyone seriously believe, on the other hand, that we could rest easy if the Axis powers were our neighbors there? If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the high seas, and they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. This is a really important piece of text, right? Or important piece of information. If Great Britain goes down, the United States would be threatened. Let's add that as a comment or as a text. I didn't have that in before. So he's letting the American people know that there is a threat. That up to this point in the speech, Roosevelt is telling the American people, look, we have the United States as enemies. The United States is being protected from those enemies by China, Great Britain, and Greece. But he goes on to say, look, if Great Britain, and by extension, if China, if Greece, if they're defeated, the United States will be in danger. So what do we do about this? The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us, the United States, to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war. Planes, tanks, guns, freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our, or American, security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them, get them to them in sufficient volume or enough and quickly enough so that we and our children will be saved the agony and suffering of war which others have had to endure. He references our children here. Politicians will sometimes reference children to make their point a little more dramatic. He says, we're not protecting just ourselves, we're protecting the kids. So he says, in a military sense, Great Britain and the British Empire are today the spearhead of resistance to world conquest. They're the ones stopping the Nazis. And they are putting up a fight which will live forever in the story of human gallantry or bravery. And then he goes on to be really clear about what he wants the United States to do. There is no demand for sending an American expeditionary force outside of our own borders. That means an American military force outside of our own borders. There is no intention by any member of your government to send such a force. You can therefore nail any talk about sending armies to Europe as a deliberate untruth. Our national policy is not directed towards war. He says its sole purpose is to keep war away from our country and away from our people. Right? So the United States wants to send supplies to Great Britain, China, and Greece, not to be involved in the war, but really, he says, to keep war away from the United States. Democracy's fight against world conquest is being greatly aided and must be more greatly aided by the rearmament of the United States and by sending every ounce and every ton of munitions and supplies that we can possibly spare to help the defenders who are in the front lines. Munitions means weapons. Let's highlight. I can't highlight that text. I can make it here. Munitions is weapons. And rearmament means building the American military. Right. So the United States is going to rebuild its military, really to help Great Britain, China, Greece, and the people fighting against the Nazis, Italy, and Japan. He goes on to talk about these next 3 paragraphs are going to be about the United States and how the United States is going to change with this new policy. He says, as the government is determined to protect the rights of workers, so the nation has a right to expect that the men who man the machines or work the machines will discharge their full responsibilities to the urgent needs of defense. The worker possesses the same human dignity and is entitled to the same security of his position as the engineer or the manager or the owner. So this is a New Deal idea coming into World War II. He wants to make sure that workers are protected when this happens. the workers provide the human power that turns out the destroyers and the planes and the tanks. The nation expects our defense industries to continue operation without interruption by strikes or lockouts. He said basically factories need to be working no matter what. It expects and insists, the United States government expects and insists that management and workers will reconcile or fix their differences by voluntary or legal means to continue to produce the supplies that are so sorely needed. On the economic side of our great defense program, we are, as you know, bending every effort to maintain stability of prices and with that, the stability of the cost of living. So this is Roosevelt telling the United States that the United States government is going to support workers, that it needs workers to be in the factories working, producing these goods so that the United States can be protected. And then he's also saying that the United States is going to support regular everyday families by making sure that prices don't get too high and that regular American people can afford everything they need. He says American industrial genius is unmatched throughout all the world in the solution of production problems, and it has been called upon to bring its resources and its talents into actions. Manufacturers of watches, of farm implements or farm goods, of linotypes and cash registers and automobiles and sewing machines and lawnmowers and locomotives are now making fuses and bomb packing crates and telescope mounts and shells and pistols and tanks. So he's saying that American businesses are going to start to do other stuff than produce the things they normally do. But all of our present efforts are not enough. We must have more ships, more guns, more planes, more of everything. And this can be accomplished only as if we discard the notion of business as usual. This job cannot be done merely by superimposing on the existing productive facilities the added requirements of the nation for defense. He's saying we can't just so we can't just we can't do the things we've always been doing plus do some military building. We need to do more. He says, I am confident that if and when production of consumer or luxury goods in certain industries requires the use of machines and raw materials that are essential for defense purposes, then such production must yield and will gladly yield to our primary and compelling purpose. So he's just saying, like, at some point, we can't produce consumer goods, televisions or radios, not televisions yet. We can't be producing radios or shoes or clothes if we need military goods. If the United States military needs medical supplies, if the United States military needs the things that would be used to produce a radio, then those supplies need to go towards building the American military. It's sort of like what's going on today. Like there was some discussion about there being a shortage of ventilators or masks for healthcare workers in the United States. And there was a call in the United States to stop producing regular consumer goods and to start producing ventilators with those materials. And that's really what Roosevelt was asking the American people to do, or telling American businesses to do. If you're not going to be able to produce the things you always did, we're going to need your machines, we're going to need your raw materials to produce guns, to produce tanks, to produce bombers, to produce naval ships. That's the stuff that the United States is going to need, and businesses are going to have to change what they produce. And he says, as planes and ships and guns and shells are produced, your government with its defense experts can then determine how best to use them to defend this hemisphere, the United States and the Americas. The decision as to how much we shall be sent abroad and how much shall remain at home must be made on the basis of our overall military necessities. He finishes the speech with, we must be the great arsenal of democracy. We must be the great supplier of military goods for the world against the enemies of democracy, of freedom. Really, specifically, we must be the great arsenal military supply against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Right. So that's the big idea in the speech. Right? We've got these notes to help us out that they're enemies of the United States, Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The United States is currently being protected against those enemies by countries fighting Germany, Italy, and Japan. But danger could be on the horizon, and the United States needs to be ready to protect itself by producing military goods and sending supplies to China, Great Britain, and Greece, specifically weapons, and that the United States is going to need to change the way it was operating to protect itself. Right? And that the United States would start producing lots of military goods to be ready to fight against the Nazis, the Japanese, and the Italians. And that's the big idea in the speech. With that information, you guys should be able to answer these 4 questions. And then you can see that Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, in March of 1941. And that was, the Lend-Lease Act was passed really making the United States, and one key idea here is that the United States is clearly was no longer neutral at this point in time. And even more so after the passage of the Lend-Lease Act. And what you guys are going to do is, the Lend-Lease Act, there's a brief description here, was passed to send military aid to the Allies, the countries fighting against Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. You can look at some pictures to see what sorts of things were being sent to those Allied powers and make a list of them here. And that's going to do it for today on Friday. We'll check in on Monday again. Thanks so much for all you guys are doing, and I will talk to you soon.